Welcome to the HRLocker podcast. On today's show, we welcome back Katie Ridge, Head of Employer Relations at Adare HRM. Katie has a broad range of experience in employment law, specialising in workplace investigations, grievance and disciplinary matters, as well as representing organisations in the WRC and Labour Court. On today's show, we talk to Katie about women's health in the workplace. Approximately 600,000 women in Ireland are affected by menopause and other women's health-related issues at any one time. These issues can undermine women's confidence, and recent surveys show that up to 8% of women affected exit the workforce as a result of women's health-related issues. Research shows that companies that are taking affirmative action by having supports in place help greatly with recruitment and retention as employees feel supported in their workplace. Katie gives us some great insights into what companies should do, how to promote awareness and create an environment where women can feel safe and have open conversations about these issues, and what policies progressive companies should put in place in order to see the benefits of supporting their female employees. This is a fantastic podcast addressing some very real topics for every company, and we hope you really enjoy it.
Today, we are fortunate enough to have Katie Ridge back with us from Adare HR, and Katie is the Head of Employer Relations at Adare HRM. So thank you so much, Katie, for being with us here again.
Thanks for having us, Crystal. My pleasure.
So today we're going to be talking about supporting women in the workplace. We'll be talking a little bit about the gender pay gap, the diverse workforce, and all those areas, I suppose, that are topical at the moment in regards to even menopause or maternity leave, things like that. So Katie, I suppose if we kick off with, as HR professionals, when we think about women in the workplace, I suppose we usually kind of think about the gender pay gap, women breaking through the glass ceiling, maternity leave, things that I suppose already have been legislated for. But I think what's important is coming to light in the last few months, I'm not even going to say a few years, is there's more to it than that. So what do you think are the main day-to-day issues that HR really should be focused on in terms of women's health?
I think that's a really good question for now. I think that we all appreciate, men and women, that the workplace has a direct influence on our health and well-being, and that people in work want to be engaged in performing quality work, and they want to have job security. They're key in terms of what people are endeavouring to have in their workplace. And I think particularly more recently, people are adding in work-life balance into that equation. I think, though, it is important, and it doesn't have to be divisive, but it's important to realise that there are substantial differences in the working lives of men and women. And this does impact, therefore, differently on the occupational health outcomes that men and women have. And I think that when we are focusing on well-being and health in the workplace, that we need to look through the lens that says that men and women have different concerns and needs in relation to occupational health. I also think it's important that men and or women are not an homogenous group, and that there needs to be a holistic account taken of the diversity between men and women, and then the diversity in terms of the different age cohorts and stages of life that women in particular are at. And I know our chat today is about women. And I think that it's clear that the most obvious sex or gender specific difference is the occurrence of menopause. And, you know, who knew that I would be sitting here talking in a forum openly about this particular aspect of women's health? And isn't it great that we are? And I think it's very important in terms of having mainstream conversations about what is clearly a normal and naturally aging part of the aging process for women. Usually it manifests at mid-40s to mid-50s, although it can obviously happen right up to the mid-60s. And then, of course, there are other indicators for menopause, which would be hysterectomy or endometriosis. So they would tend to be the key catalysts in the lives of working women in terms of them finding themselves at the perimenopause or menopausal stage of their life. It's also important, though, to include transgender men and people who are intersex or identify as non-binary, because they may experience menopause symptoms too. For people who may, be looking for, I suppose, a definition or a working definition of menopause, because I appreciate that this is an informative session, and that one of the outcomes that any of us involved in this would like to see is that there may be development of policy in workplaces, but we can touch on that later. But certainly, if one was setting themselves up in relation to being aware as a starting point about menopause, essentially this is an occurrence in the group I've just touched on, where there hasn't been a menstrual cycle in the last 12 months. And the symptoms, many of them are well known, but no harm to identify them for the purposes of our podcast. The common ones are hot flushes or flashes, I've heard them referred to as, sleep disturbance, mood changes, headaches, and weight gain. And I suppose if you're really unfortunate, you'd have them all, which would be particularly trying. But in terms of statistics, we're talking about a huge group of people that this is going to impact at the relevant stage in their lives. Approximately 600,000 women in Ireland are affected by menopause at any one time. Mm. And the other important factor is that menopause symptoms can last, Crystal, anywhere between 4 and 8 years. So we're not talking about a couple of weeks or months. Mm. Up to 60% of women experiencing menopausal symptoms have identified that it creates a particularly negative impact on their work. And worse again, approximately 8% of participants in recent menopause-related studies have identified that they have actually felt the need to leave their employment due to menopause. So they are important facts around a physiological condition that manifests in women at some point in their working lives. So I think that alone is reason enough for us to take menopause seriously, and to have it as something that we can talk about and support in the workplace.
Yeah, and I actually totally agree with you, Katie, is that, we're talking about a subject that I think 5 years ago we wouldn't have been talking about, that it's such a taboo about. Even, you're talking about menstrual cycles and things like that, and I straight away was like, oh gosh, I don't know, can we mention that? But like it shouldn't be a taboo subject. It's something that happens to every woman, so it's something that's really important. I think maternity leave obviously has been heavily legislated for years in Ireland. Parental leave we have adoption leave as well. Is there other legislation specifically for women's health? And the reason why I mentioned that is you were talking about in terms of the symptoms of menopause, talking about the sleep deprivation. We're talking about people could have some depression to go with it, or people are leaving the workplace. And if it was considered as a mental health issue, which, I don't think it should, but if it wasn't, that we would legislate for that. We would say that, we'd have to, you'd treat it as a mental health issue. Yeah. So is there any legislation for it at the moment?
Well, it's interesting because I think that the reason we would ask the question, is there any legislation, which essentially means rights or protections around this issue, is because that we do understand that, well, firstly, that the area has been shrouded in taboo. for generations. And secondly, in some quarters, it might be seen as a topic to make fun of.
Yeah.
I think that the taboo and the inappropriate humour add to the challenges that the women have already in terms of the physical and emotional changes that are happening to them, obviously, and there's very little that they can do in ease of that. And I think that touching on some of the studies that have been done around menopause and there being the negative impact felt by women in respect of their work, it's clear that many women find that these symptoms, physical and emotional, that they can undermine hugely their confidence in terms of their ability, which as a kind of domino effect would be causing them to miss out on promotion and or training. In some instances, the difficulties are acute and that would require them maybe to reduce their hours, which of course has effects in terms of income and may have effects in terms of how they're perceived for purposes of senior positions in the organisation. So pay levels are dropping. That's contributing in a particular way to a widening gender pay gap. So there's a lot of landmines in terms of women navigating their way through the menopause. So there isn't a specific statute, and probably because of the taboo that has been shrouded in. But that's not to say that one couldn't determine that legal issues may arise in really, Crystal, on the grounds of discrimination. So that if a woman who was going through menopausal symptoms, felt that they were being treated particularly differently, i.e. less favourably than somebody who isn't going through them, that there would be certainly the premise in relation to employment equality for them to bring a discrimination claim. And, what we would be thinking about is, well, what would be the grounds for that complaint? And essentially, we started off identifying that occupational health differences arise very much because of the gender difference. So gender would certainly be a ground upon which women may establish unequal treatment. And while it may seem inappropriate, because I suppose of what we would associate with the term disability, it could be associated with in terms of unfavourable treatment on the grounds of disability, because it would be recognised as a medical condition. And indeed, medical conditions, many of them are, and there's plenty of case law establishing that medical conditions are part of the definition of disability. There's also, I suppose, for people who would be employed in the public sector, there is the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act of 2014, and this creates a public sector duty. So essentially, under the IREC Act, Section 42 is the public sector duty. And this requires public bodies to have regard to the need to eliminate discrimination and to promote equality and protect the human rights of staff and people who are availing of services. So certainly the staff part of that would be a platform upon which somebody could make a complaint. So you could have somebody complaining if they were in the public sector on the public sector Section 42 ground, and they could also complain in relation to employment equality legislation. We know that we have the Employment Equality Act, and that prohibits discrimination on 9 grounds. And clearly, different treatment, less favourable treatment, where maybe menopause symptoms are treated differently than other medical conditions. I think that could certainly be a banana skin for employers, that they would recognise perhaps obesity, they might recognise anorexia, they might recognise epilepsy, alcoholism, a whole range of conditions which we can find ourselves subject to, but they mightn't have ever factored in something like menopause. And of course, indirect discrimination it arises when people are treated less favourably as a consequence of policies, typically. So it's not that the employer is setting out and saying, I want to treat women who have menopause in a less favourable way, but indirect discrimination and the principle behind it allows a complainant to point to, for example, a particular policy, and to be able to demonstrate that as a consequence of that policy, and for my example, there being no inclusion of menopause as a medical condition in a particular policy, and therefore it was never recognised, perhaps in the performance management of somebody or in some other oversight of somebody's performance. I think that that would be a strong enough basis on which somebody could bring a discrimination claim. Just maybe in ease of that, just read very briefly from a recent UK case, and this is the case of Merchant versus BT PLC. And here the employee was found to have suffered from direct sex discrimination and an unfair dismissal. Miss Merchant was dismissed for poor performance, but her manager failed to take into account her menopausal symptoms, even though she'd given the manager a letter from her GP outlining her impaired concentration. The manager should have investigated her health problems linked to her menopause further, but instead he made stereotypical assumptions based on his knowledge of the experience of his wife and a colleague. And the tribunal decided that the manager would never have adopted what they described as a bizarre and irrational approach with other non-female related conditions, or would have treated a man suffering from ill health with comparable symptoms in this way. So I think certainly in that UK finding, and of course common law jurisdiction, so the outcomes would transfer very neatly into our jurisdiction. We can see that there was a subjective analysis of what menopausal conditions would mean, and this was all premised on the line manager's conversations with his spouse and with a colleague. So there was no objectivity, there was no medical factual recognition in terms of the significance of the woman's condition vis-a-vis her performance at a particular time. And so we can see that the employer was clearly wrong-footed, and they lost that particular dismissal claim. I suppose, if time allows, closer to home in relation to this other possibility, which is the disability ground. I've already referenced that the definition of disability under the Irish Employment Equality Act is expansive, and it includes certain mental health issues or particular medical conditions which are potentially chronic, debilitating, or get worse over time. And all employers are obliged, subject to a disproportionate burden cost, to provide under Irish equality legislation reasonable accommodations for persons with a disability. So this requires the employer to take affirmative action in relation to the needs of the person who has the particular disability. So clearly in some instances menopausal symptoms could be classified under the definition of disability, and the employer should act accordingly. There is a case that is under appeal at the moment to the Labour Court, McNally and the Rotunda Hospital. And in that particular case, Miss McNally brought claims against her employer on the grounds of gender and disability, and she was alleging victimisation on the basis of the non-provision of training and failure to provide reasonable accommodation. And she also has alleged harassment. And on the disability ground, she stated that she suffered from stress and the effects of the menopause. And so her employer, they accepted that she was retired on ill health grounds related to incapacity due to disability. So they accepted that principle, but they argued that there was no basis for arguments to be made in respect of alleged discrimination around stress or alleged effects of menopause. And the matter has been appealed to the Labour Court. So we await with interest what the outcome of that will be. So again, the principle is at play there, and the facility for somebody to bring a claim on the gender and or disability ground. I suppose finally, in relation to legislation, the employer has a statutory duty under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act. And so that is a continuing duty in relation to employees at every stage in their working life. So again, if we were talking about somebody being unable to carry out work as a consequence of their being under particular occupational stress, and that is aligned with a condition like menopause, well then at a minimum it would appear to me that the employer would have to investigate in relation to reasonable accommodation provision, or they would be at a minimum they'd be on the back foot in terms of their legal duties to their employees, including menopausal women.
So Katie, I've written about 5 things down that I want to ask you that I wrote down as points. Is that one in regards to the affirmative action, which is really interesting, and the duty of care, because if you think about the work in terms of how the workforce has changed over the last, let's say, 20 years, we've got women who are staying in the workforce longer, so in regards to your own company, you would think that if you've got that cohort of women who are over 40, you need to basically take the duty of care into account. You need to focus on your duty of care, affirmative action in regards to policies around that. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting in regards to the Rotunda Hospital thing, that the case that you spoke about there, as well as the other case that you spoke about, is the training, how important that is in regards to your managers. Then it's not just, and so what I'm thinking is that how important is it for companies to create policies before they need them, create training programs before they need them in regards to not just menopause, but in regards to women's health in the workplace in general?
Yeah. Well, there are a range of things I think that employers need and actions that they need to be thinking about and indeed taking. And I think in terms of what we've been talking about, menopause and the fact that we're coming from a fairly negative historical perspective around it. We've touched on the taboo and it being maybe in some quarters a matter of ridicule. I think it's really important generally, and again, we're in a world where there's an undersubscription of talented staff for workplaces, so there's another reason for being on your game in terms of are you doing what employees need. I think that certainly one amongst many responses that an employer should be engaged in is positive messaging and information. So, they should be highlighting that menopause is recognised as a medical issue and that it therefore will fall under wider occupational health awareness initiatives. So very much, and particularly so since the pandemic, wellness has moved well up the agenda of any functioning organisation. And so under that wellness umbrella, certainly menopause should be sitting in there along with any of the other issues, mental health or any other issues that employers have highlighted. And guidance should be there in relation to workers and line managers. And one should be trying to generate an environment whereby, if it's required, there can be open discussion and respectful discussion about menopause, so that then empowers people to speak up, because I certainly think that there is a reticence on behalf of people to speak up. They wouldn't have that reticence in terms of looking for parental leave. They wouldn't have it in terms of looking for force majeure leave if they had to take time out to care for parents or some other dependent, bereavement leave. There just wouldn't be the same reticence, I don't think, in terms of those kinds of supported leaves as there are with menopause. And I think that in terms of your point on training, that line managers, men and women, need to understand the impact that menopause can have on work and what adjustments might be necessary. Indeed, some managers might have their own experience of it, but everybody who's in a position of line management is not going to have that. And so therefore, I would start on the premise that people haven't got sufficient information. And I think maybe we have mental health well-being champions in many workplaces. I would see this as an ideal space in which to have a champion in terms of menopause, because if we recognise, and of course we're trying to improve it, but if we recognise that we're coming from a position of taboo, there could be a reticence culturally, and that could be emphasised in relation to ethnicity and cultural diversity within our very diverse workplaces. It may not be appropriate, or some women may not feel it appropriate to approach, for example, a male line manager in relation to these issues. Or again, in terms of people who are transgender, intersex or non-binary, they may have additional challenges around raising that particular issue with a line manager. So I think having a wellbeing champion that could be a point of contact for both the line manager and indeed the employees would be a good idea. I think another important area, Crystal, would be clear sickness procedures. So, you know, sickness absence procedures should make it clear that they are sufficiently flexible to cater for menopause-related sickness absence. Indeed, on that flexible word, and happily, I think we have become more emancipated in relation to flexibility and the workplace. I think that there is no argument now in terms of there being reasons that would prevent an employer in having some flexibility to meet the need of menopausal employees. I mean, what I'm getting at there is if there was the need to maybe suddenly leave the workplace because somebody was feeling very unwell, or it could be the case, and is frequently the case, that you may need to use the toilet more frequently. And in some very progressive workplaces, there is actually a kind of relaxation room that is available for maybe pregnant women in terms of the second and third trimesters, where clearly they're carrying additional weight around, and or anybody who their symptoms require them to be able to take a load off, as it were. And we can see in progressive workplaces that is also being included for women who may be, I suppose, overcome in terms of hot flushes, brain fog, and simply needing maybe 10 minutes where they can put their head down and being embarrassed to do so on their desk, because that clearly is not usual practice. And then, in some very progressive organizations, there are moves to have a menopause policy. And that would be where the organization would, under that distinct heading, they would be considering directing employees to support channels, and they would also be including in that policy the facility for some adjustments to the workplace or maybe their working schedule if the need arises. And I think then there are some very practical things that employers could bear in mind. Again, we never thought COVID would be gift bearing, but it has brought some positives. So I've touched on the flexibility that it has certainly provoked in workplaces. Ventilation has become an important issue as a consequence of COVID. Ventilation is certainly a friend of menopausal women. That may not be something that employers would have thought of. Indeed, many buildings, modern buildings, the windows are not able to be opened. So you could be looking at air conditioning or the provision of fans for people. Cold drinking water at hand is very important in terms of menopause symptoms. Obviously allowing time off work in terms of attending appointments as we would for any other matter. And then I think also the provision of many uniforms are polyester because they last and endure and come out the way they went into the washing machine, unlike some other fabrics. But polyester would not be a friend to somebody who's having hot flashes. And so, that there was a facility that would allow maybe women to wear clothing of their preference that is in ease of those symptoms. I think that would be very progressive.
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting in terms of, we talk about all these things that companies should be doing, Katie, but I think that a lot of both women and managers would find it difficult to approach people about the subject without causing offense. And I definitely think that's a hang up from, the last 100 years more.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because I think that we as a society have been inculcated in that is how that you whispered about women's reproductive health. You didn't converse at the usual level, and that's even if you did have a conversation about it. So it takes a while to get into that space of comfort. And certainly think that it's improving. But yes, you can understand, and particularly the fact that for most people who are experiencing this, they are in their mid-40s. I touched on earlier, you will certainly have instances of early menopause, and that could be in the early 30s. But the bulk of people are going to be in their mid-40s to mid-50s. So unfortunately, they have probably grown up with that sort of shroud of silence around menopause. And so they may need encouragement and they may need confidence in terms of discussing the challenges that they have with their employer. Absolutely.
And I really like the idea of giving that, I suppose, appointing that champion of who could be somebody who's approachable, because I definitely agree that sometimes it's easier to speak to a female. That's just, the way you'd be brought up in regards to issues that you can talk about. And I also think that sometimes it's difficult to speak to a manager if they just don't have any idea what you're talking about. They're not prepared for the question that you're about to say or that you're about to tell them that, look, you're going through menopause and you need some time off or whatever it is. So I think for for companies to make it an easier topic is appointing that spokesperson that champion really important, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the champion, needs to be skilled in terms of how they approach the sensitive discussion, because that's going to be an enabler and that'll foster other follow-ons. And if I have a good experience with the champion and you and I are having a discussion around the issue, then I would consolidate, well, X has been really helpful. And I think just some very basic tips around that. You obviously need to have a space that can't be interrupted when you're having that conversation, because what you're saying as the champion is that I am a discreet, available support to you, and clearly you want the environment to be right for that confidence building exercise. I think that, so you have the quiet place, you do the obvious, you shut down your phone and you're not available for the duration of that particular meeting and you can't be interrupted. And I think what you do is you encourage the employee with the menopause symptoms or challenges. You simply allow them to talk and you listen actively and you show empathy and understanding. And you should be prepared for silences and struggles in terms of the person managing to articulate what it can be quite a private and intimate, because that's how they've dealt with it. And yet they're struggling because they're very committed to their role and the organisation, and they're finding this inordinately difficult because it's impacting on their productivity, and their wellness and their enjoyment of their work. So I think ask simple, non-judgmental questions and don't patronise with responses. And I think also, if I come in and then if somebody comes in a week later, don't assume that we're going to have the same experiences, because that isn't the case. And menopausal women, when they do talk about symptoms, can, have a whole host of them at different times. Some people will never have some of the particular symptoms, and some people will have more or less of them. So I think if you have concerns about how somebody's coping, it's okay to say something general like, how are you doing at the moment? I wouldn't be starting with, yes, I've noticed you've been arriving late for the last while, or I'm seeing you using the bathroom, very frequently. And it's up to the individual, obviously, to disclose. But I think if you have an appropriate environment, that can really act as a catalyst. And again, that the word would spread then within the organisation that this is a supportive facility, and I think that would be self-sustaining then going forward.
Yeah, I presume not a good way to start is saying, hey, I think you could be at that age that you're going through the menopause.
Definitely not. No, absolutely. It's possibly, it's that would definitely not be a good start. Yeah.
So what do you think, if companies are building a policy around menopause in the workplace, what should it include? What does a good policy look like?
Well, I think that in terms of the policy, you're going to have, diversity and inclusion as the drivers in that policy, because what you're essentially saying is that we recognise that people come in all shapes and sizes, they're at all different stages in their life, and we embrace people in terms of whatever stage they're at in their life and whoever they are. And so your policy, if it has those hallmarks, will be reaching out to menopausal women, will be reaching out to transgender, to non-binary and intersex employees. And maybe it's a good idea in the policy to have a statement, in ease of the transgender, non-binary, intersex community. I think that what we don't want is there to be an assumption, and maybe an historic assumption, that this is only to do with women. So you could say something like, while we use the words woman, she, or her throughout the policy or the document, we understand that others may experience menopause type symptoms. And this is a policy that is designed for all of our colleagues. And then really, I think it's simple in terms of linking into your HR or well-being strategy. I think it is important to have a definition in there of menopause. I think that just keeps people focused in terms of, and, you know, people who are looking for support and people who are supporting, that they're in the space of knowing what they're dealing with. Very helpful to have the range of symptoms in there, because somebody could be feeling very isolated because something in particular is happening to them, and it mightn't be one of the more mainstream or mightn't be one of the more commented on symptoms. And then I think it would be very important to have your reasonable adjustments or accommodations identified, and how one would go about looking for those.
And Katie, you know what I think is just sad and fascinating at the same time is that we spoke about that menopause can start as early as 40, sometimes earlier. Why are we only starting to talk about it now? Is it just because that it's a taboo subject, or, you know?
Well, personally, I think it is because it is a taboo subject. I also think, you know, and I mean this respectfully, I think the world in which we live has been designed by men. In many instances, and that takes a particular lens on particular subjects, and it would be a very emancipated, empowered man that would have a very keen awareness excuse me, of challenges around menopause. And that's not to say those men don't exist, they do, but a lot of the kind of granular policies that we have in the workplace in the first instance have been informed, maybe not through the lens of the person that the policy is supposed to address the issues for. Now, we're getting much better at this, and there's a lot of different nudges along the way. Interestingly, I think perhaps in trying to demystify and not have it as a taboo subject, certainly as part of an initiative, the government launched the Women's Health Action Plan. I think it was around Women's Day this year, and this, believe it or not, and I was quite surprised at this is the first Women's Health Action Plan that the state has produced. So, you know, we're yes, yeah, that has been focused kind of across the range of women's health issues. And essentially it's designed to have I suppose, a strategic framework to prioritise women's healthcare into the future. And in there, in the midst of that, and the facilities that it contemplates supporting, is a new approach to menopause care. And there is one, and there will be 4 specialist menopause clinics in the country. I understand that the first one is up and running in the National Maternity Hospital, and there will be 3 more to follow in the 3 other provinces. So look, it's a small start, but also included under that umbrella, because we're not just talking about menopause, is a fantastic and long overdue initiative with local authorities to tackle period poverty, you know, where people don't have the capacity to buy sanitary products appropriate in their household, because they have to pay the electricity bill and feed children. I mean, it's amazing to think that in 2022, but that is the case. So there's a new approach with local authorities, and indeed I think some supermarkets have talked about introducing initiatives around free period or menstrual products. I'm not sure that has come to fruition yet, but we're moving well down the road. There's also a maternity bereavement survey that's being undertaken to establish, again, there's a paucity of supports in relation to that particular issue. We were well aware of the instances of infertility and assisted human reproduction. There's a whole range of legislation, of course, that would have to support that, but I know that this women's health package is looking at the better regulation and support of that. We touched on endometriosis being a catalyst for menopause. That is something that's very poorly supported within the state presently. So there's more commitment and more finance directed at endometriosis care. And then there would be additional supports for breastfeeding, both in and out of the workplace. And then a perennial one is eating disorders for women. So I think that augurs, well, that there is a focused initiative. So I suppose in conclusion, Crystal, I would say that if we want to continue to move the needle, as it were, in respect of women in the workplace, and particularly in leadership roles, and we want to maintain the valuable contributions that women make to the company's bottom line, we need to be more open about lots and all of these health issues, and particularly menopause and how it affects individuals and organisations. And it's empowering, isn't it, to acknowledge that any taboo subject loses power when someone with authority addresses it openly. And it's all of a sudden, it hasn't got a hold on people, and it's not something that they're embarrassed or fearful to discuss. And I think we're learning, and we've shown some very progressive achievements around race and gender, and indeed age differences in the workplace. And there's no reason why we can't put menopause on the agenda and make progress in the same way.
And I'd agree. I mean, we've seen over the last decade, for sure, the advantages of having a diverse workforce, in regards to race, in regards to gender, and I think that and age, for sure. And so I think that this is, I suppose, maybe just the natural next step in regards to really kind of focusing on that diversity. Isn't just a race issue, or it isn't just, purely an age issue. There is that gender issue there. And, there's huge advantages in having a diverse workforce.
Absolutely. And it augurs well in the practical sense for everybody else in that diverse workforce. They see role models at different stages and ages in their working lives. They see that, it is possible to have a successful work-life balance. They see the contribution that people from all diverse backgrounds make to the totality of the organisation. And I think that that's very important in keeping equality as an important thread generally in workplaces. So hopefully we're on the road to this being a topic of conversation, and that it will be one that will empower people who to date have avoided at all costs raising the issue, have struggled, with a lot of stress, a lot of their confidence being undermined, have struggled through and are struggling through a considerable period. I mean, a pregnancy, 9 months, in terms of the duration of menopause, it's identified as anything from 4 to 8 years. That is particularly extended period for somebody to endure in silence. So let's hope that we're moving into a space where people feel empowered and are being empowered by their employer organisations to get assistance and support if and when they need it.
Yeah, and I definitely think that we're moving in the right direction, and we can see that there's some really strong, successful female leaders over the last few years. But they're still a minority. What do you think needs to change in order to bring parity to those top roles?
Well, I think that employment equality legislation has definitely provoked employers to think about the range of representation that they have in the organisation. I think that we can always do better. I think that if we are better than lip service in terms of flexibility, and I mean, flexibility is a two-way street, and employees can be, and have been, I think, historically very good at demonstrating their flexibility at busy times, whether it's staying on late or taking on a project in the absence of maybe somebody who has had to vacate, maybe because of illness or some other reason. I think that people are very clued in this, I suppose, workplace of undersupply, in looking at the really important attributes of what an employer has to offer. And I think that while pay will always be a feature for everyone to some extent, very definitely the ability to progress, the ability to have flexible working, I think the ability to be respected and taken on merit are very important attributes that employees are increasingly looking to identify in new and prospective employers. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, particularly in the space of the buzzword for 2022, undoubtedly, is retention. That employers are, acutely aware that it's the combination of these facilities that are there and their supports that can be relied on at the time the employee needs them. So they don't need them consistently. They're not 24/7, but at different stages in people's working lives, they will need some of these supports. And I think if the employee can be assured and confident that they're able to use those supports with the endorsement of their employer, and there is a genuine facility there for recognizing that there has to be a little bit of elasticity in the relationship, and it's a give and take, then I think that augurs really well in terms of sustaining current employees and attracting new ones.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more, is that companies need to focus on the benefits. It's not just a give to employees. You're sustaining people, you're retaining them. What you give, you get back.
Yeah, and it's nearly a cliche, but a happy employee is a productive employee. Rather than the two entities working against each other, and being technical as to why people can't have this and can't have that. I think that if you have a respectful adult relationship, professional relationship with your workforce, then people are in the main wholly reasonable, and you can rely on them as an employer to do what they're committed to do, and they can rely on their employer to support them when they need that support. So I think that's the win-win that we're all looking towards.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. I've really enjoyed our chat today. And
me too. Look forward to chatting to you again.
Yes, and I think it's been really informative, and I hope people take a lot away from it. So again, Katie, the best way for people to contact you through LinkedIn or your email?
I think that if people want to contact us, Crystal, yes, they could contact myself directly, and they'll get me at kridge@adarehrm.ie, or they could reach out to us in Adare at www.adare.ie. we'd be delighted to talk with people about this and any other area that we can support them in.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at HRLocker.com. The show was hosted by Christelle Rinn and produced by Jenny Martin. Subscribe to catch the latest episodes on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. If you'd like to feature, get in touch by emailing us at marketing@HRLocker.com. You can also follow HRLocker on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.